Back in February of 2021, my wife Sarah and I rented an isolated cabin up in the mountains for a weekend getaway. We'd both been overwhelmed with work for months, and the idea of disappearing somewhere quiet for a few days sounded perfect at the time. We found this secluded A-frame cabin up in the mountains, about 3 hours from where we live. The listing looked perfect, cozy, completely surrounded by woods, and totally off the grid. The host operated fully remote, meaning we didn't have to meet anyone. We were just emailed a gate code and a lockbox combination for the front door. We arrived right as a massive winter storm was rolling in. By the time I pulled my Jeep into the long dirt driveway, the snow was already coming down hard, sticking to the windshield and piling up on the wooden porch. We hurried inside, lugging our bags through the front door, and immediately felt relieved by the blast of warm air from the cabin's heater. It had that distinct, rustic smell of old pine and fireplace smoke. I locked the deadbolt behind us. We dropped our bags in the bedroom, and I tossed my everyday carry stuff, my wallet, sunglasses, and my car keys, onto the large butcher block island sitting right in the middle of the kitchen. We spent the first hour or so just settling in, listening to the wind start to really howl outside. It felt incredibly isolating, but at the time, that was exactly what we wanted. Around 7 o'clock, Sarah started making dinner. I was sitting on the couch in the living area when she called out to me, sounding a bit confused. I walked over, and she pointed at the kitchen island. Right in the center of the dark wood counter, there was a fine, chalky layer of white powder. It looked like drywall dust. "Did you drop something?" she asked. I shook my head and wiped it away with a damp paper towel. I looked up at the ceiling. "Probably just the wind," I told her. The storm outside was getting aggressive, rattling the window panes and making the whole cabin groan under the pressure. I figured the heavy gusts were just shaking the old rafters and knocking years of settled dust loose from the ceiling. It made sense to both of us, so we brushed it off and went back to cooking. By midnight, the wind was deafening. We were cleaning up the kitchen, getting ready to turn in for the night. Sarah was wiping down the counters while I loaded the dishwasher. That's when she stopped. "It's back," she said quietly. I looked over, right in the exact same spot on the island. Another perfect little dusting of white drywall powder had settled. I frowned, stepping closer to inspect it, and as I did, the house creaked. It wasn't the broad, groaning sound of wind hitting the exterior siding. It was sharper than that, localized. Sarah took a slow step backward toward the sink. The ceiling creaked directly above her. She shifted to the left. Another creak followed her movement almost immediately. My stomach dropped. The sound was coming from directly above us, and it was tracking where she walked. I stepped back and really looked at the ceiling for the first time. The cabin was an A-frame, meaning the roof outside went straight up into a steep, high peak. But the ceiling over the kitchen was totally flat. It was dropped, maybe only 8 feet high, creating a hidden void between the kitchen ceiling and the vaulted roof above it. Directly over the kitchen island was a dark, slotted wooden ventilation grate. It was maybe 2 feet wide, painted the same dull brown as the ceiling panels. I told Sarah to stay put. My voice sounded shaky, but I tried to play it off. I went over to my duffel bag in the living room and pulled out the heavy Maglite flashlight I always bring on road trips. My heart raced. The adrenaline was already starting to pump through my veins, making my hands feel clammy. Every instinct was telling me something was horribly wrong, but my rational brain was still trying to convince me it was just a raccoon or some heavy draft in the insulation. I walked back into the kitchen. Inside the cabin, it was dead silent, except for the muffled roar of the blizzard outside. I stood right next to the island, positioned directly beneath the vent. I pointed the heavy metal flashlight upward and clicked the button. The bright white beam cut through the darkness of the grate. I stopped breathing. Staring directly down at me, pressed absolutely flat against the wooden slats, was a human face. I froze. It was a man. His skin was horribly pale, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, and reflecting the harsh glare of my flashlight. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even squinting against the light. He was just lying flat on his stomach in that cramped, pitch-black crawl space, staring down at us with a completely dead, emotionless expression. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. A wave of pure, paralyzing terror washed over me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't look away from his eyes. He'd been up there the entire time, watching us cook, watching us talk, watching us walk around. I turned the flashlight off. I grabbed Sarah's arm. I gripped it so hard she let out a small gasp. "We are leaving. Right now," I whispered, my voice trembling so badly I could barely form the words. I didn't wait for her to ask questions. The look on my face in the dim kitchen light must have told her everything she needed to know. We backed out of the kitchen slowly, keeping our eyes glued to the dark ceiling. We crept into the living room, blindly grabbing our winter coats and boots from the rack near the front door. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely work the deadbolt open. "Grab the keys," I whispered to her. "Where are they?" she whispered back, panic rising in her throat. "On the island, where I put them." She glanced toward the dark kitchen. "They aren't there." I looked. The spot on the butcher block counter where I had dropped my wallet and keys was completely bare. And then the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The dust on the counter earlier, it wasn't from the wind shaking the cabin. It was from him. He had been up there the whole time. He lifted the wooden grate above the island, reached down into the gap, and quietly took my car keys off the counter. He had my keys. We didn't say another word. I threw the front door open, and we plunged out into the blinding, freezing blizzard. We left all our bags, our laptops, everything. We just ran. The snow was waist deep in some places, and the wind felt like ice slicing into our skin. We hiked for miles in the pitch black, slipping on the frozen road and pushing through the drifts, entirely fueled by absolute terror. Every time the wind howled behind us, I shivered, terrified that it was him catching up. After what felt like hours, we reached the main county road and managed to flag down a passing snowplow. The driver led us into the heated cab, and we immediately broke down, calling the police from his radio. Because of the severity of the storm, the police couldn't get up the mountain to the cabin until late the following afternoon. When they finally cleared the driveway and went inside, the place was totally empty. They found the access panel to the crawl space above the kitchen. There were a few dirty blankets up there, some empty food wrappers, and a terrifyingly clear view down into the cabin through the wooden slats. But the man was gone, and so was my Jeep. They never found him, and they never recovered my car. But that's not what keeps me up at night. What messes with my head, what makes me freeze up every time I hear a floorboard creak in my own home, is trying to figure out his plan. He already had the keys. He could have stolen the car hours earlier while we were in the bedroom, but he didn't. He stayed up there, perfectly still in the dark, just watching us. He waited until the blizzard was too bad for us to leave on foot. He trapped us there, and I still don't know what he was waiting to do next. I took this trip in late October of 2023, around the point where I was honestly starting to burn out pretty badly from work. I'm a software designer, and for most of that year I'd barely left my apartment in Seattle because I was working remote nonstop. I hadn't taken a real break in months. By then, even hearing Slack notifications was enough to make me tense up. So I decided to get away for a few days and booked this small Airbnb cabin in northern Washington. The listing looked completely normal. Tiny wood cabin, hiking trails nearby, wood stove, no Wi-Fi. Just one of those disconnect and recharge places in the middle of nowhere. The only thing that stood out a little was how much the host talked about privacy. Not in a creepy way exactly, just a lot. "This property is completely private. You likely won't see another person your entire stay. I respect guest solitude." Stuff like that. At the time, honestly, that sounded perfect. The cabin was about 20 minutes off the nearest highway near an old logging road. The farther I drove, the worse the weather got. It had been raining most of the afternoon, and by the time I got there around 5, everything already looked dark and soaked. Huge trees everywhere, no neighboring cabins, no lights anywhere in the distance, just forest. The host never showed up in person. He just messaged me the door code about an hour before check-in. The first night was completely normal. I made pasta, had a couple beers, and watched movies on my laptop while rain hammered against the roof. The cabin had these huge windows facing the woods, and once it got dark outside, they basically turned into mirrors. Every now and then I'd catch myself staring at my own reflection because there was literally nothing visible beyond the glass. Before going to bed, I remember double-checking both doors because being out there alone was making me a little paranoid. The front door had a deadbolt, and the back door near the kitchen had one of those sliding chain locks too. I made sure both were locked. I went to sleep around midnight. The weird part started the next morning. I woke up around 7:30 and immediately noticed mud on the kitchen floor. Not a ton of it, just footprints. At first I assumed they were mine from the day before since I'd walked around outside after arriving. But when I crouched down and looked closer, something immediately felt wrong. The prints were narrower than my boots, and the tread pattern didn't match at all. My hiking boots had these square grooves on the bottom. These prints were smoother, almost rounded. The tracks started near the back hallway and stopped at the kitchen sink. That was it. No prints leading back out. I remember just standing there staring at them, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. I even compared the bottoms of my boots to the floor like an idiot. Didn't match. Still, I convinced myself I must have somehow missed them the night before. The rest of the day I tried not to think about it. I went hiking for a few hours, drove into town for coffee, then headed back before it got dark. But on the drive back, I noticed a truck parked partially behind the trees, maybe 100 yards from the cabin. Older pickup. Dark green, I think. At first I figured it was probably the host checking on the property or something. But the weird part was where it was parked. It wasn't in the driveway or anywhere visible. It was tucked off near the woods, like whoever parked it specifically didn't want to be seen from the cabin. I slowed down a little, expecting somebody to wave or pull out. Nothing. And by the time I unpacked my stuff from the car, maybe 10 minutes later, the truck was gone. That night was when things stopped feeling normal. I woke up sometime around 2 a.m. because I heard movement outside. Not knocking, just movement. Slow footsteps maybe, wet leaves crunching. At first I stayed in bed, trying to convince myself it was an animal. Then I noticed this faint shadow moving past the bedroom window. I got up and looked through the blinds. There was a man outside. He was slowly walking around the cabin with one hand sliding along the exterior wall as he moved. Not banging on it, not trying doors, just dragging his hand across the wood like he was feeling his way around the building. I can still picture it perfectly. Every few seconds the porch light would catch him as he passed the windows. Dark jacket, jeans, head slightly lowered. But the part that really got to me was that he never looked inside. Not once. Even when he walked directly past brightly lit windows where he absolutely should have seen me standing there. He just kept staring straight ahead like he was counting steps or following some route he already knew. I completely froze. I don't even know how long I stood there watching him circle the cabin. My chest felt tight, and I remember hearing my heart beat louder than the rain outside. Eventually, he disappeared around the back again. I waited maybe 30 seconds before finally moving. Then I locked the bedroom door, even though I knew realistically it probably wouldn't do much, and sat awake until sunrise with a kitchen knife beside me, trying not to panic. The next morning, there were muddy footprints again. This time they stopped directly outside my bedroom door. That was when I finally messaged the host. I asked him if he'd come by the property overnight. He answered almost immediately. No, I'm out of town this week. Haven't been near the cabin. At first I thought he was obviously lying, but later that afternoon I was looking back through the Airbnb listing, and I noticed something strange. The truck in the host's profile photo looked exactly like the one I'd seen near the woods. Same color, same dent above the rear tire, but the license plate was different. I don't know why that bothered me so much, but it really did. That night, before bed, I spread flour near both doors. Honestly, I felt stupid doing it. Like I was turning into one of those paranoid people from horror movies. But I wanted proof somebody was getting inside somehow. The next morning, the flour was untouched. No footprints near either door. But halfway down the hallway, fresh muddy tracks suddenly appeared and continued toward the kitchen. I just stood there staring at them, because there was no logical way someone could have walked through the cabin without stepping in the flour first. That was enough for me. I packed everything before noon. Didn't even bother cleaning up. I just wanted to leave. While loading my car, I happened to glance toward the trees behind the cabin, and there he was again, standing partially behind the tree maybe 50 yards away, completely still. The second I noticed him, I got this awful sinking feeling in my stomach because I realized he'd probably been standing there watching me pack the entire time. Then slowly, awkwardly, one of his arms lifted into a wave. Not a normal wave either, just the forearm bending upward stiffly. The second I got into my car, he started moving. Not running, just speed walking straight toward the cabin with his head lowered like before, weaving through the trees in this weirdly direct path. I panicked and drove straight across part of the lawn instead of backing up properly. As I reached the logging road, I looked once in the rearview mirror. He'd already reached the porch, and I saw him place both hands flat against the front window and lean forward, staring into the empty cabin. I contacted Airbnb after I got home, but the listing had completely disappeared. Dead link, deleted profile, everything. A few weeks later, I got curious and started searching hiking forums to see if anybody else had stayed there. Eventually, I found an older cached version of the listing someone had posted months earlier. Same cabin, same photos, different host name, and parked outside the cabin in the profile picture was another truck. Different color, different plate, same dent above the rear tire. In October of 2017, my friend Nolan and I rented out a converted barn on an isolated farm for a weekend getaway. We'd been wanting a break from the city for a while, and the Airbnb listing made the place look peaceful. Just open fields, dense woods, and almost nobody around for miles. We arrived late in the afternoon. The crunch of our tires on the long gravel driveway was literally the only sound for miles. It was eerily quiet. The host, an older guy named Arthur, came out of the main farmhouse at the far end of the property to greet us. He was overly accommodating, smiling a little too wide in this worn-out flannel shirt. The property itself was gorgeous, but as we pulled in, I noticed it was littered with several dilapidated, windowless outbuildings. They looked like they hadn't been touched since the 70s. Arthur gave us the standard check-in tour. The inside of the barn was actually really nice. It smelled like old wood and fresh lavender. But before he left us to unpack, he pointed out the kitchen window toward a large, corrugated metal shed sitting maybe 50 feet behind the barn. "Just a heads up," Arthur said, and his tone suddenly dropped its cheerful edge. "Stay completely away from that metal shed out back. The roof is caving in, and there are some dangerous structural issues. I don't want anyone getting hurt." We nodded and agreed, but as I looked out the window, something didn't add up. If the shed was so dangerous and abandoned, why was the grass leading right up to its heavy sliding doors completely dead? It was trampled into a deep, wet, muddy path. It looked like someone walked back and forth to that shed a dozen times a day. I brushed it off. It was a farm after all. People have chores, right? The first night went fine, but on the second night, things started getting weird. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a strange, low-frequency humming sound. It wasn't loud, but it was deep. When I got out of bed to get a glass of water, I could literally feel the vibration traveling through the barn's wooden floorboards, right into my bare feet. It felt like a massive generator running somewhere nearby. I shivered, rubbing my arms in the cold dark. It eventually stopped around 3 a.m., and I managed to get back to sleep. The next afternoon, Nolan and I decided to take a walk along the tree line behind the property. We were kicking through the crunchy autumn leaves when my boot hit something hard and hollow. I knelt down and brushed the dirt away. Half buried in the soil was a pile of discarded, heavy-duty rubber gloves and 4 empty-gallon jugs of industrial bleach. They looked recently dumped. A cold spike of unease hit my stomach. My heart did a weird flutter, but I didn't want to freak Nolan out. So, I just told him it was probably farm garbage and steered us back toward the barn. By nightfall, I was completely on edge. Every time I looked out the back window toward the farmhouse, it was pitch black. No lights on at all. And then, the humming returned. It started around midnight, vibrating the floorboards again. But this time, it was accompanied by a new sound. It was the unmistakable, muffled, mechanical roar of a commercial wood chipper. And it was coming from the pitch-black yard outside. By 3 a.m., my heart was racing. I couldn't breathe right. I couldn't just lie there in the dark listening to it. I quietly got out of bed, crept up the stairs to the second-story loft window, and peeked through the horizontal blinds. Down in the yard, illuminated only by the pale moonlight, I saw Arthur. He was struggling to drag 3 massive, heavy-looking black contractor bags out from the sliding doors of that supposedly unsafe metal shed. He was straining, his boots slipping in the mud. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. The shape and weight of those bags. I was terrified I was about to see the rigid shape of a human body. But as he heaved the second bag over a rut in the dirt, the thick plastic snagged on a sharp rock and tore wide open. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a body. Hundreds of items spilled out onto the pale dirt. Shredded, blood-soaked pieces of clothing. Jeans, jackets, half-torn shirts. Dozens of cracked cell phones. Intact leather wallets. They poured out in a sickening wet pile. The sheer volume of it made my head spin. I felt physically sick. This wasn't just one person's belongings. It was a terrifyingly large-scale collection. Down in the yard, Arthur cursed loudly. He dropped to his knees in the mud, frantically scooping the bloody phones and fabric into his arms and throwing them into the open trunk of a sedan parked nearby. Then, he froze. He stopped moving entirely. He slowly stood up, wiped his hands on his pants, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a high-powered hunting flashlight and clicked it on. He didn't search the yard. He swept the blinding white beam directly up to the second-story loft window, right onto my face. I froze, trapped in the light like a deer. My blood ran completely cold. Through the glass, I saw Arthur drop the torn trash bag. He reached into his trunk, pulled out a long metal crowbar, and started sprinting toward the barn. He didn't say a word. Adrenaline flooded my system. I scrambled down the stairs, practically yanking Nolan out of bed. "We have to go now," I hissed, grabbing our coats. We didn't even put on shoes. As we locked the bedroom door, I heard the heavy deadbolt on the barn's front door downstairs splinter and crack. He was inside. We squeezed through the tiny first-floor bathroom window, dropping into the freezing wet grass just as we heard heavy boots hit the wooden floorboards in the hallway. We ran blindly into the woods, the branches tearing at our faces, and hid in a dense thicket of brush, shivering and terrified until the sun finally came up. We walked 3 miles to the main highway and flagged down a passing car to call the police. When the local cops finally searched the property later that morning, they told me I must have been imagining things. They said the metal shed was completely empty, save for a few rotting bags of fertilizer. Arthur and his sedan were gone. The police took a report, but nothing ever came of it. I tried to put it behind me. I really did. But last month, Nolan was looking through the digital photos he had taken of the farm on our first day there. I was looking over his shoulder when he pulled up a wide shot of the barn, with the metal shed in the background. I asked him to zoom in on the shed. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold all over again. There were no power lines connected to that shed. Not a single wire ran to it from the main house or the street. It was completely off the grid. The low-frequency humming, the vibration in the floor, the muffled roar of the machinery. None of it had been coming from the shed. It had been coming from a hidden basement, directly underneath the bedroom floor. That's it for today's stories. Honestly, after going through these, I don't think I can ever stay in a strange Airbnb again without checking every single corner, let alone look at a flat ceiling or a floorboard the same way. If you've ever had a creepy or unexplainable experience while staying away from home, feel free to share it in the comments. If you crave these true horror accounts, remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the dead of night. And before you go to sleep, just take a quick look at the ceiling vent above you. Is it completely empty?